Raymond, I'm very interested in miracles. And when we study, for instance, the history of Israel, 48 war, 67, 73, all those Arab nations surrounding Israel. I mean, in many respects, the Jews didn't have a chance, but they won. And there are many, I've studied a lot of this stuff, and I've even talked to some people that know, and they had relatives that told them, and granddads or dads, etc. There were true miracles that happened on many occasions when there would be whatever, like 1 million Arab tanks, and there was just one person, one Jewish Israeli soldier somewhere, and that later the Syrians or the the Arabs that were fighting were saying that they saw like 1 million Israeli tanks behind one soldier, but those tanks were never there. Stories like that, right? And then they ran away because of that. And as Christians, the way that the Holy Spirit and how God put Jesus into Mary's womb, a miracle. Jesus' resurrection, miracle. How Jesus walked on water. And in the stories that you tell, there are miracles. Could you talk about that a bit and maybe tell us about one?
Absolutely, you're very correct about the parallels, which themselves, because they're in different times and places and contexts, really validate this idea. You were talking about in the Jewish wars where they would see legions of armies. To give you one example, in the Battle of Antioch, which took place after the first Crusaders had conquered, or rather reclaimed Antioch, because a few years earlier Muslims had seized it from Christians and the Crusaders had liberated. But when it was all said and done, they were in there. The Crusaders were thousands of miles away from their homes, vastly outnumbered. Most of them had died from pestilence and famine and just fighting with Muslims. And then finally, the Muslims they took them seriously and got a massive army together and went to confront and to essentially annihilate them. And it's interesting because speaking of just war theory, the Muslim said, "What are you doing here? Why are you even bothering?" And that's when the Christian said, "This was our land. You stole it. You seized it from Christendom, and so forth." But when it came down to it, the Christians. I have the numbers. I think it was something like maybe 10,000 against 60, 70,000 Muslims, and they actually destroyed the Christians who were emaciated, starved, and just because they had gone through a year or a year and a half siege, whereas the Muslims were fresh and had just come and they're on their own home territory. And that battle in the historiography of the time is always described as a vast miracle, with the Crusaders and soldiers seeing armies and heavenly hosts descending and helping them. So it's very, very similar to what you described, which I'm familiar with as well, with Israel and its wars with the Arabs. And I find that continuum very interesting. And again, I try to bring it in the book, though I know most readers approach this with a very secularist bent, and they'll immediately dismiss it as whatever, mass hallucination or whatever, just superstition. But it's important. It's at least important because it helps you understand how they thought back then.